What's up, guys? Ian here, coach of your Lightning Lantern, and the Surrey Stingers, and the Kelowna Crocodiles, depending on where you know me from. I'm bringing you a little bit of a different video from my normal, just flat-out team builders, draft analyses, season recaps, battles, and whatnot. Excuse me. I haven't done like sort of an off-the-wall um, draft league video in a very long time, since like my Google Sheets for Beginners series, which ended up focusing more on sort of draft league sheets. I still have a lot to learn, but I've definitely improved a little bit on that at the very least. Wanted to bring light to one of my favorite Pokemon, if not my favorite Pokemon to use in Draft League. I've got extensive usage of this Pokemon, and I just sort of wanted to maybe bring it to the forefront a little bit, because I don't necessarily think it's underrated by any means. I just sort of feel like it's maybe left on the back burner for a lot of people once they see the stat total, and I sort of just wanted to highlight Mimikyu, maybe recap a little bit of my history with Mimikyu, and then sort of talk about the strengths and weaknesses of Mimikyu, and how you, as someone who's maybe not as experienced with Mimikyu, can use Mimikyu to your advantage. So that is kind of all that's up in terms of this video. You definitely don't have to look at the screen. I've got some screenshots here. I've got quite a few screenshots here, but you could just turn this off and listen to it instead if you so choose. So first up is my experience. So I am very experienced with Mimikyu. I have 52 games played with it in standard draft, and it's not got 91 kills for me, which is an average of 1.75 kills per game, and it's only died 29 times for me, 4 of those being passive deaths. I've got 2 championships with it in UPBA Season 1 and MWPA Season 5. I used it UPBA Season 1, UPBA Season 2, which only lasted for 2 weeks before that ended up just collapsing upon itself. Mount Silver, I used it in Season 2. League of Extraordinary Trainers Season 1, which is way back on my channel, just like UPBA, almost 2 years ago at this point, actually. I actually franchised it in LET Season 2 and then dropped it because it just didn't fit the team that I'd sort of drafted around it. MWPA Season 5, I had it on the team I picked up. PTL Season 1, I had it, as well as WPL Season 8. I don't believe that I'm currently using it in any leagues that I'm playing in now. So that would have been the last time that I used Mimikyu was WPL Season 8. But that's quite extensive. That's a few leagues there, obviously. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8 different leagues that I've used this in and brought it to 52 games. It's actually still the highest games played. I went through my NCL stats, and it's still the highest games played even after my NCL season. Um, so yeah, that's pretty much what's going on with Mimikyu. It's my most played mon of all time in draft format, and it's got the highest kills by a country mile in terms of my usage of the Pokemon. The second screenshot there you see is my tournament record. My tournament play record with this mon. I've used it in the GBA Fan Draft League Season 2, which was last summer. I uploaded that and I made top 32 in that tournament. I used it in the LET Mono tournament, which was just sort of a really fun one. I managed to draft Mono Fairy, and so I grabbed my big boy Mimikyu there, as well as March Madness 20. Oh, LET Monotype, I made top 3. And then the March Madness 2019 tournament, which was this past March. I'm recording this June 30th, depending on when I upload this. That's for reference. There you go. March Madness happened early March into, I believe, St. Patrick's Day was brackets. Or maybe the day before St. Patrick's Day was brackets or something like that. I made top 56, which was the bracket stage, and then I got yeeted out of round 1. So I've done fairly well in tour play, in 8-mon play, and I've used Mimikyu on my main teams there, the GBA and the March Madness ones, which were quite a few people. LEC Monotype was kind of just thrown in there just for statistical purposes, sorry. It hasn't performed super well for me in tours. It ends up dying in a lot of the games that I bring it to. It's definitely got the most games played for me in tours. I think it might be tied with Mew in terms of games played in tournament play for me. But it's sort of the same sort of level. people tend to have better answers to it in tour play, or I have to panic sack it in hopes that I can win a game with something else, or I just end up sacking it because I just straight up lose. Tour play is a lot different. Like 8 mon versus 11 mon is actually quite a different feel for sort of the threats and how you can play around the threats, considering you have a lot less defensive checks to their Pokemon, and especially the way that I like to play with Mimikyu, which I'll get into in a second. Well, actually, probably a little bit later on down this video, but uh, the the way that I like to play with Mimikyu personally doesn't sort of fit tour play as much. It's just a nice comfort mon that I like picking in tours because it definitely it requires them to get off at least 2 turns of damage because of disguise. In most cases, I should say. And these screenshots are taken from my all-time kill leaders doc, so they are a little bit compressed because they're longer across the top. I wanted to have they're both at the top in terms of kills, but I wanted to have the bar showing you guys what each column represented, so that it wasn't just useless stats for you. Um, yeah, so that's sort of my experience with Mimikyu, just so that you have a basis on why I'm even talking about this. It's like, oh, is he even a credible source? Well, this is sort of just to prove that I am indeed a credible source on Mimikyu, considering how frequently I've used this Pokemon in Draft League. For reference, I've played 415 games of Draft League since I started in October 2017, and Mimikyu's still got 52 games played. So that's actually not as much as you would think for 415 games played, but I've sort of been forced, whether it be because of other people drafting Mimikyu or because of sort of the draft that I've built for myself, or I wanted to try a different fairy. I haven't defaulted back to the same thing. I think I've got over 200 Pokemon under my belt in terms of what I've used. I know I counted earlier. I think I've finished 42 leagues or something, and I'm currently in 5 that are ongoing at the moment that I'm recording this. So I think it's 47 leagues that I've participated in at this point. So that's quite a lot of sample size. Now, I went through my teams and sort of threw out some team compositions here just to sort of show you maybe what a good or a bad team looks like built around Mimikyu, and just sort of talk about my success in these particular seasons. These are seasons that I use Mimikyu in, and sort of what the team composition allowed Mimikyu to do in those scenarios. So first of UPBA Season 1 was the season that I won. It was my first draft league, and it was my first championship. I managed to draft Mimikyu really late. That's actually the draft order rather than rather than like anything to do with tiering and whatnot. Actually, I think all of these might be draft order. Just based on what I'm seeing, these might all be draft order from earlier on. Although PTL went through quite a few changes. But let's first talk about UPBA Season 1. I made one drop on this team. I made a couple actually. I think I had Mantine originally, and I traded it for Crobat. And I had something else that I yeeted out of there for Ambipom. I can't remember what it was off the top of my head. I'm not sure if the music's being heard. I'm just going to turn up the music a little bit here. Muted and unmute it maybe. There we go. It's a little bit low, but let me just get that going there. Just the music doesn't cut in and out. I don't really want to edit this, so I'm just going to leave it like that. But this team was fairly successful. I mean, it wasn't super great in the regular season. I went 6-6 and then just pile drive through playoffs because I was a lot more comfortable with the team at that point. Mimikyu ended up being the league kill leader with 19 kills in 12 games. Mega Absol was a waste of time. I wouldn't even bother drafting that thing again, but it was really supported well by Infernip and Crocodile. And that's sort of a main theme, is that offensive fires and offensive grounds really, really, really pair well with Mimikyu, because the biggest thing standing in Mimikyu's way in terms of winning a game is fat steals. That's the biggest thing. On that team, I had one of them, which was Registeel, so it helped that I didn't have to play another Registeel team. Mega Aggron was quite a problem, but wasn't really a problem for Infernape plus Crocodile, or potentially the Piloswine as well was quite obnoxious for Fat Steels to deal with as well. Kyurem Black having Earth Power, and especially in that league, it was a Z Captain for me, so it had access to Z moves. This was kind of the first time where I discovered Z Splash, which is my favorite set to use. It's not something that I came up with necessarily, but I've definitely popularized it in terms of my social circle and the sets that people use. If they ever get a chance to get Mimikyu when they're playing with me and whatnot. But it was also helpful to have a Pokemon like Suicune something that was just it's extremely obnoxious for people to deal with that they had to prep for. The rest of the team, they could kind of just throw random coverage moves on, and they didn't have to be too concerned because they weren't just going to outright lose a game to something like Heliolisk. They weren't going to outright lose a game to something like Pilliswine, Ambipom, Crobat, and whatnot. So the supporting cast wasn't like super problematic for people to deal with, but something like Suicune is it just puts so much pressure on someone that you have to like almost over prep for Suicune just because it can 6-0 you if you don't. And that sort of helped out Mimikyu in terms of that season and the success that it found. Next up was LET Season 1. I actually played that one at the same time as UPBA Season 1. It was a Wi-Fi league that I uploaded to the channel. I uploaded most of it, I believe. At least the regular season. I can't remember if I uploaded playoffs or not off the top of my head. It's there if it's there if I did, and if it isn't, then I definitely do not have the video footage of that. So I don't know what to tell you about that one. I managed to get Magearna in this one, and I got Magearna, Manaphy, and a Mega Latios that gave me points. There weren't a ton of like it was a pretty brand new in terms of people like actually knowing how to play in the league. And I grabbed Mimikyu really late in the draft. People sort of like didn't recognize that it was a Mon, and so I got it really late with a ton of free points because I gained free points from the Mega Latios, and I didn't blow a lot on. I hadn't blown a lot on my free picks, so I had a lot that I could spend on the Mimikyu there. It was quite successful on that team. It was my kill leader, I believe, which is fairly impressive considering I had a Magearna. Actually, it was second, I think, behind Magearna, and then Nidoking was like third or something. But there were a lot of threats on that team. I ended up dropping Manaphy late in the season for Thunderous Therian, which choked me my semifinals match in that league, and so I managed to finish third, or a tie for third, I should say, after losing in semis. But Mimikyu put in a lot of supportive work. So once again, this was sort of another good example of the offensive ground and fire. Nidoking and Mamoswine were both gigantic problems for people in that league, and Rotom Heat was more of a defensive fire, but could still deal with offensive steel, or sorry, fat steals very well. The supporting cast of like well, I wouldn't say, call it a supporting cast necessarily, but mons like Mienshao also helped out against the steals. Good fighting types. I guess I forgot to mention that about Infernape, but good fighting type really helps out. Yeah, it didn't have the fat all that much necessarily. A lot of my games were like very offensive, offensive-minded games with a lot of people just trying to pivot into Magearna and unsuccessfully doing so because I had a good plan set out in most of these games. But having such a gigantic problem threat like Magearna, having another water type that was just extremely difficult to deal with in the Manaphy again, another mon that people have to over prep for, it'll sweep you. Mega Latios, same sort of thing. Mamoswine, same sort of thing. It just led to a lot of success. Both of these teams had relatively poor hazard support on them, like offensive rockers that I wouldn't necessarily want to run rocks on, besides the Registeel and UPBA, but these were like my first leagues, so I didn't have a ton of experience in terms of setting up rocks. I tended to not set up rocks as much as I prioritize now because I do realize that rocks chip is like extremely helpful in terms of winning games. And it's a little bit surprising to me that my Mimikyu history is sort of a large grouping of the kills is from those two seasons in particular. UPBA Season 2, I ended up franchising Mimikyu, and I drafted that team around it with the Mew and whatnot. It was a lot less supportive of Mimikyu, and it was sort of more based on potentially Greninja, Thundurus, and Mega Houndoom being sort of the core offense. When that league died, I was 2-0 plus 7 coming off my championship, and I was in a solid position to sort of make playoffs and whatnot. But again, the league sort of just imploded from within, so we never finished that season. Mimikyu, I think, had like 4 kills, maybe. I do remember it having quite a few by the time we were done those 2 games, but I know it had quite a few kills because I set it up in positions where it could win. Um, MWPA Season 5 was my second championship, and this was a team that I took over, so I never had to make any changes to it. It was a free draft league, so I had quite a few solid Pokemon on the team. Again, with the offensive fire, Infernape and Mimikyu are the only 2 Pokemon that I've won multiple championships with, I believe. Nothing else was shared between those 2 teams. Oh, Pilliswine, sorry. I've won titles with Pilliswine and Fernape and Mimikyu. Those are the 3 shared ones. And again, it's sort of the same idea with the ground, fire, and fighting, being able to cover the fat steals that Mimikyu doesn't really like. Zygarde helped a lot in that one as well, and it was really hard for people to prep for Zygarde plus Celesteela, and so Mimikyu kind of went unnoticed, and it actually clutched a few games for me, especially in playoffs. Mimikyu was a gigantic problem for people in playoffs because I was a little bit better at the game at this point, and I was relying a lot on Spike's Roserade, and Spikes were getting me a lot of chip in terms of my game plan of letting Mimikyu sweep. Mount Silver Season 2, I drafted the Double Fairy again. At this point I was really comfortable with Mimikyu, and it was definitely the kill leader on this team. It actually got more kills than Magearna did on this team. People were a little bit better prepped for a Magearna in this league because they were a little bit better coaches than they were in LET Season 1. Again, with the offensive firing ground, I had the Garchomp and the Mega Houndoom. Both of those really helped out the Magearna as well. It's the same sort of idea as that Magearna needs relatively the same sort of help as Mimikyu does in terms of offensive synergy. It's another Roserade. I didn't end up winning this league. I made it to semis again, and so I tied for 3rd there as well. The fat on this team just didn't really pull through. It was quite offensive, and I didn't really have a lot of good pivots, especially because Hitmontop is not very good. It's a decent spinner, but it's really just not a reliable defensive check to pretty much anything. Because you can sort of just pivot around on it, and it's not really able to punish the mons that it's switching into all that well. PTL Season 1 is a league where I demolished and didn't make playoffs because of bullshit rules. That's really besides the point. Again, I paired it with Mamoswine, and I paired it with Darmanitan. They both covered it very, very well. Zapdos was such a problem for people. I ended up dropping a lot of the defensive aspects to this team and just rocking with a really offensive team, which actually kind of opened the door to Mimikyu, another door to Mimikyu that I hadn't really discovered before. It was sort of nice to just rely on Mimikyu as a cleaner. I brought it as a breaker a couple times and just led with it and like blue Z turn 1 kind of thing. But it ended up functioning a lot more as a cleaner, or at least opening the door for Kartana to clean, and Kartana was just such a problem for people. That's sort of what the team ended up looking like. There were a lot of defensive aspects to it. I ended up dropping Registeel at some point in the season, Slowking at some point in the season. We had like 8 different. We had 8 drops that we could do, but we can only do like 2 a week or something. It was super strange rules, but the main core of the team was the Megalodios, Zapdos, Mamoswine, Mimikyu, and Scrafty. Those all stayed on the team the entire time. The rest of it came from various transactions throughout the season. And Mimikyu led the team in kills, or it might have been second actually behind Megalodios that season, but it was super solid on that team. So I've got a few more team compositions here. I think just 3 more. My WPL Season 8 team, this one was a little bit less successful, although in terms of the actual team, it didn't end up being that least successful. For most of the season, Mimikyu actually was deathless, and the only death it sustained was in the regular season, I should say, was a meme match where I was running a level 27 Mimikyu, Sash Destiny Bond. No, I wasn't running Sash, was I? I was running Destiny Bond though, Trick Room Destiny Bond on my Mimikyu, and it died to Curse Swampert from Bash in a nice meme match. I think week 11 or something like that. It didn't die any of the rest of the games in the season, and that's the only passive kill that Mimikyu has on my all-time kills is that Destiny Bond kill against Bash. This team, yeah, so like I mentioned, it really needs an offensive ground, a fighting, and a fire to deal with. Beware didn't come to as many games as I would have liked. I ended up putting a lot of the offensive pressure on Zapdos on this team. It really struggled to break through the defensive steals in this season because I didn't have a fire either. I think it's fairly necessary to actually have a good fire on the team to be able to deal with this, and so that's why I've sort of put all 3 of these teams on this slide because none of them really have good fires, and they were all less successful than they could have been if I had had a fire. So the big thing with WPL Season 8, I lost to Lux twice, and Lux was the Celesteela team, and Celesteela proved to be such a problem in both of those games. Despite having Zapdos, I really just wasn't able to pressure the defensive steal as much as I needed to. I don't think Mimikyu came to either of those games. It might have come to the second one. I don't recall it coming to the first one, though, but it might have come to the second one. And in that game, I just got a little bit steamrolled because I just wasn't able to deal with Celesteela with enough. I needed to preserve my Zapdos, and unfortunately that led to me making some different plays than I probably should have had I had something like a Darmanitan on the team, something just to be able to really pressure the steel types, or at least put them in a range where Mimikyu could set up on them later, sort of thing. My March Madness 2019 team, I was proud that I made brackets with this team. Mimikyu was not really the star of this team. Terrakion went like 13-1 or something. That was most certainly the star of this team. The fighting type just helped so much against the steals. But again, it really came down to not having a good fire type because in certain situations, I was forcing myself to lock into close combat against something like a Ferrothorn when a Sylveon was a really good switch in just because I didn't have the fire type to be able to break through something like that Ferrothorn. And that ended up being quite costly in my last match actually. I just wasn't able to deal with Kartana very effectively on that in that game. Um, Probably because my fire was a freaking Torracat. So that's what ended up happening in that run. GBA Fan Draft League. I actually don't remember this. This was from like last summer, about this time last summer, actually, like July-ish last summer. I didn't have a fire type on this one. I did have the Garchomp, and it really helped that I had Celesteela on my team. The problem is that other people had Celesteela too. I don't think I actually played anyone else with the Celesteela, but Garchomp and Nidoking were huge helps to the Mimikyu. Mega Manectric was a really reliable way of being able to deal with mons like Celesteela and Skarmory. Why is the music just not playing? This is weird. There we go. Sorry, I just had to skip a little bit forward there. Um, yeah, I had ways to deal with like Celesteela and Skarmory. Skarmory is one of the better checks to Mimikyu in the entire game. And that's sort of what ended up happening in terms of that I made top 32 and then I just got absolutely bodied in the top 32 game. But the fire type would have really helped that team composition out. This one had a lot of hazard support on it. The WPL team did not. I would have preferred to have a better set of rockers on that team. It really forced Garchomp into running rocks quite often. And March Madness, while I did have quite a few rockers, it was mainly Greninja with spike support that was a big part of that team's success. Excuse me. So I've sort of laid out some standard sets here for Mimikyu, just to get like into it and sort of. These are really good breaker sets that can clean from the mid game on because they have a nice power. They have a nice burst of power that can help them get through some stuff that you might not have the team support for. Excuse me. So you can sub out the Mimikyu MZ for a Ghost UMZ if you want on Shadow Claw, and it's a fairly effective breaker against pretty much anything. That set that I put there has Drain Punch on it. That's fairly necessary if you want to be able to break through steel types at all. But essentially, what your game plan is using Disguise to the best of your ability. So being able to use Disguise as a setup tool is perfectly fine, but if you need 2 hits on something, then there's really no point in you setting up an SD on the turn that they're breaking your Disguise, and you should really just hit them in the face. Especially if you're faster than them, sometimes it's better to SD in their face, but if you're slower than them, you definitely want to just try and hit them twice. Mimikyu's got really good SpDef. It's actually the highest stat that Mimikyu has, and people seem to sort of underestimate the special bulk that Mimikyu has. It doesn't really drop to very many special hits in one shot. Even things like Shadow Balls from very offensive ghost types don't take this out in one hit unless they're boosting item on things like Gengar and Chandelure in particular, who both have relatively high offensive stats. It's not impossible for Mimikyu to die, but it's not as likely as you might think either. Yeah, so the Z set is very it's set on sort of just being able to get up an SD and then nuke something really hard that's going to stop your Mimikyu from sweeping. Again, mons that are faster than this, you definitely want to just be hitting twice. Because you're not running Shadow Sneak on this set all the time. You can definitely swap out Shadow Claw for Shadow Sneak if they're a lot less weak to Ghost, or Drain Punch for Sneak, I guess. If you have a better way of dealing with their Steel, that's kind of the better idea there. All in all, the Mimikyu MZ is just the best Z Crystal that Mimikyu can hold in most cases, especially if they don't have Fairy Resists, because Z Play Rough is boosted. So if you wanted to run Fairy MZ, you also could do that, but there's really no point when Mimikyu MZ is a higher base power than what Fairy MZ turns it into. It gives it more power with Mimikyu MZ. Nice unique Z Crystal that I got in Ultra Sun, Ultra Moon. So, with that set out of the way, let's move on to the Life Orb set. Now, this is a very standard set. This is the standard laddered set. Although on the ladder you typically run Adamant, you don't really have that wiggle room in draft. A lot of the time you're going to be playing against a base 95 on their team, and you want to be speed creeping that so that you can set up on it potentially. Something like a Curum Black is actually really important to be speed creeping, because if it outspeeds you, it's just going to one-shot you right through. Excuse me, right through the disguise with terrible. So really important to be speed creeping properly. But obviously the special attack doesn't really matter, so it's really almost always better to run Jolly unless you can afford to run Adamant. Typically, you don't need to run Adamant because you get the free turn of setup. And with the Life Orb set, you have that extra immediate power that you can to get through stuff. You don't really care about taking the recoil, which is kind of the beauty of Disguise as well, is that you don't really give a shit about taking the Life Orb recoil when you get a free turn. Essentially, against anything that's not a Mold Breaker or Terravolt Mon or is using Photon Geyser against you, you get the free turn. So there's really no reason not to run Life Orb. I'm typically really against using Life Orb sets on almost anything, but Mimikyu is definitely something that I would promote Life Orb on, just because there's the downside to it is not there. It's not there unless they can break your disguise and then revenge kill you with something like a Scissor with a Bullet Punch or something like that. Typically, if you're going to want to set up with Mimikyu, you'd want something like Scissor to be very weakened or dead so that you can't be revenge killed, because Shadow Sneak's not going to do all that much to a very physically defensive steel like a Scissor. And so you'd want to get at least enough chip on there so that you could kill it with a Shadow Sneak at +2, because you obviously outspeed Scissor, and priority moves from the faster Pokemon go first. So again, it's the immediate power with Life Orb. This can definitely break through a less beacon team more easily than the Mimikyu Z set, but the Mimikyu Z set can break through a bigger problem for Mimikyu to sweep later in the game. So again, that's sort of the same sort of idea there. Another beauty about Disguise is that if you really need to, and you can sort of force people to switch in on a Swords Dance, then you can maybe get the Z move off against something that's going to wall your Mimikyu, and then you can bring it in later and set up again if you really wanted to as well. I've got some more unique sets that I've personally used in draft here on the next slide here. These are more matchup unique sets. It really depends on what you're playing against. So, for example, this Electric Seed bulk up set is something that I brought. I forgot to add the little EVs in there, but this is something I brought in the LET Monotype tournament against a Mono Poison team, because it was fairly effective against that team actually. I'd ran Electric Seed. Actually, I don't remember running Electric Seed. I think I ran Leftovers, but this is sort of a decent example. I kind of memeing myself there. I ended up clicking rest in my own electric terrain that Coco set for me, and so that's why I put Electric Seed on there. But yeah, it was bulk up rest talk with Shadow Claw. Bulk up's kind of criminally underrated just because of Mimikyu's physical defense being quite lower than its special defense. And so, you can run a bulk up set and it's about as effective against a physically offensive team. At the same time, you could probably just run Will-O-Wisp in that spot, but bulk up obviously boosts your attack stat as well, so it's not all that bad. I ended up choking against a Mega Venusaur and a Scolipede, and so the set didn't work as well as I would have hoped, but it was fairly effective at surprising my opponent at the time. I've got a red card set under there. This is a phenomenal Hawlucha check. Mimikyu is one of the best answers in the game to Koko Lucha, especially if you can preserve the Mimikyu to be able to red card out the Lucha and then just cancel out the Unburden entirely. Any Unburden sweeper, red card Mimikyu is absolutely amazing against. It's always a failsafe against anything that you would possibly want it to be a failsafe against. Anything like a Mega Scissor or something like that, it really doesn't matter. You can always just attack on the turn that they're attacking you, and that's sort of the best aspect of it. I threw Will-O-Wisp on the set because this set doesn't normally run Shadow Claw all that often. It shouldn't need the Shadow Claw normally because the things that you're trying to phase are generally frail, and so you'd rather click something like a Shadow Sneak against them after they come back in after being phased out. The Normalium Z set up at the top there is my absolute favorite set to run as a cleaner set in this game. I normally sub out Drain Punch for Shadow Sneak, but In this scenario, this Theorymon scenario, I'm faster than the things that are remaining in the game. Generally, that's not how it happens. Most of the time, your opponents are going to keep things that are faster than Mimikyu in the back before you want to clean with Mimikyu, and so Shadow Sneak is almost mandatory on those sets. But if you have a better way to work around that in the matchup, then by all means, don't run Shadow Sneak. It's a very weak move, and so you don't need it in almost any scenario like that. It requires a lot of chip even against frail psychic types. Well, sorry, I shouldn't say frail psychic types, but relatively frail psychic types. Mons like Jirachi that would otherwise sort of just drop to Mimikyu's Ghost Spam. Obviously, Shadow Sneaking against Jirachi is like super prevalent because Scarf Jirachi is like one of the more common Jirachi sets, and you don't want to just get flinched to death by the Jirachi. So you want a way to hit it before it can hit you. Yeah, so with the Normalium Z set, Z Splash, if you didn't know, Z Splash gives you a +3 attack boost. So essentially, it's a one-time use Sword Stance +1. And this actually got me quite a few kills in UPBA. It was my favorite set to run. I ran it, I think, a couple times in WPL, but I don't recall it actually doing anything there. It's a super solid moveset. People sort of look at the Z Crystal, especially on Wi-Fi. If you're in a Wi-Fi league, in LET, I use this and it surprised a lot of people. They're like, "Oh my God, Normalium Z, what does this do?" And then they just lost to Z Splash Mimikyu because it's so much more powerful. If you can position it correctly and get all the proper chip on Pokemon, by setting out a good plan for yourself early in the game, or by scouting sets effectively, making sure that you're scouting sets to gain knowledge about their bulk in the calculator, sort of seeing how much HP they have invested, how much defense they have invested, what sort of chip your Mimikyu is going to need later on in the game. If you know your Z Splash set, you can calc ahead of time that you're going to be at +3. Most of the time, you're going to get that to work because of your disguise. You basically just get the free Z Splash, and then you can kind of go in. And so that's sort of one of the ways that you can effectively position Mimikyu. Again, it does require good planning. And so if you're not a very patient person, or you sort of rush through turns, then I don't really think that Mimikyu's necessarily for you, but you would probably just want to use the Life Orb set like every single time. The Z Splash set definitely requires careful planning compared to the Life Orb set, because an SD Life Orb set is almost as effective as the Z Splash set in terms of damage output. Yeah, so essentially that's what you're looking at is more careful planning, just because you have that extra damage there. The last set is a Choice Scarf Trick set. Now, this one's a little bit nifty. It does give you sort of a surprise on speed control against quite a few things, and it can lead to just Shadow Claw sweeps late in the game. It doesn't rely on hitting player off as much as you normally would have to, because you can just sort of like cleave through things with Shadow Claw critting them and whatnot. It's got Woodhammer on there just because I wanted to show off Woodhammer on one of these sets. Woodhammer is a very cool tech that this Pokemon gets. It's a very high base power grass move, and it lets you break through bulky waters that might otherwise want to phase you, or haze your stat boost away. Toxapex is kind of the exception to this. Toxapex and Tentacruel being the exceptions, but Tentacruel doesn't really take physical hits well, so you can always normally just hit it with the Shadow Claw. And most of the time, a Tentacruel that's going to outspeed you is not really going to live 2 Shadow Claws anyways. So, yeah, that's what the Mimikyu set's there for. It's got a few cool options. It obviously has Will-O-Wisp status, which I showed off in the red card set. It's also got Thunder Wave as well as Toxic. I didn't throw a Trick Room set on here, but I'll sort of discuss the Trick Room aspect of this. You can also run red card Trick Room. Trick Room's a very viable strat on a red card set. I've brought it against Rain quite a few times, just the Trick Room variant of Mimikyu. It's not super effective. You might think that it's like, oh, I should just run Trick Room Mimikyu. Well, it's a base 96 speed mon, so it doesn't function all that well in Trick Room. Even if you're Brave 0 IVs, there's a lot of stuff under that that's still gonna underspeed you in Trick Room. And so you don't, like, Trick Room is very niche in my mind. It doesn't have a ton of uses. Just running through like the options that this Pokemon gets, just so you know. In terms of physically offensive moves, the specially offensive moves are fairly irrelevant. Base 50 special attack is really bad, so it doesn't really back it up with anything like that. So it does get moves like, Dark Pulse, Dazzling Gleam, Giga Drain, things like that. Pretty irrelevant moves that you're never going to see in Draft League. Pain Split's kind of unique in terms of what it does. Hone Claws is a nice way so that you don't miss your player offs. Excuse me, Destiny Bond's obviously a very unique tech. It does get Light Screen. It does not get Reflect, but it does get Light Screen if you want to be a little bit creative with that. Shadow Claw and Shadow Sneak are typically on most sets. Return is pretty useless. I've seen Sub a couple times. Again, Sleep Talk's fine. It does have Taunt support as well, so while it's not the biggest support move set in the world, it does have some support. Curse as a ghost type is kind of unique. Grudge is kind of cool as well. It's something that you don't normally see, but it can come in handy every once in a while. Excuse me. Obviously, it gets Mimic, which is its namesake, of course. Psych Up is pretty cool as well. If you wanted to have um, something just to be able to steal boost, it's kind of the same idea as heart swapping with Magearna in Ubers. It's fairly common. Um, you can blow your disguise and psych up some stat changes, which could maybe put you in a really good position. Or you could blow the disguise, psych up the stat changes from like a specially offensive threat or something that you're not going to be able to break through, like maybe a Calm Mind Mew or something like that you might not be able to break through. That's kind of a bad example, but let's just say Calm Mind Mew, right? You could steal the Calm Minds, and then all of a sudden the Mew's less of a threat for your specially offensive mon that might be able to kill it later on in the game. It does get Snatch, so you can run Z Snatch shenanigans for some speed control. It's fun. I've done it a couple times now, actually. It's not super viable. And it does get Workup if you did want to go with sort of a mixed route. One very unique set, and shoutouts to Ben, by the way, for this. Shiny Stabilize 17. This was probably one of the cooler Mimikyu sets that I've ever seen. It's not something that I've used myself, but might be something that I would look into in the future. Mimikyu does get Thunder, and so he actually ran a Z Thunder set with Mimikyu, EV'd to kill Skarmory after rocks, kill a physically defensive Skarmory after rocks. And that was really unique. That was a really cool way of breaking through one of Mimikyu's premier checks in the Skarmory there. It's a little bit harder to pull off against the Celesteela. You'd probably need a lot more EVs to beat the Celesteela with that, just because Celesteela has much better Spit F bulk than Skarmory does. Just from being an Ultra Beast, it's just got like a pile of stats, right? And so it's just a little bit harder to break through Celesteal with that sort of set, but I'm very curious to use that against the Skarmory in the future, because sturdy Skarmory is quite a problem for Mimikyu. Obviously it lives hits with the top tier physical defense that it has, and it can just whirlwind Mimikyu out, or it can Iron Head it and break the disguise and whatnot. So it's quite a problem, and so let's talk about some of the Mimikyu checks in the game. I didn't put Skarmory on this list. I felt like Celesteela was good enough. Apologies if this slide is just like lagging to high hell for you. My OBS is having quite the problem with this, but I wanted to use the HD sprites, and I had the HD Mimikyu sprite as the background for the entire video. But Mega Aggron, this sort of encompasses mons like Registeel as well, just like really bulky, like pure steel types. It's very difficult for Mimikyu to break through these. Mega Aggron in particular, because of Filter. Filter just means that Drain Punch is not enough to be able to break through something like Mega Aggron. Registeel is a lot easier to break through with Mimikyu, because typically it's going to run like a mixed defensive variant. It's not necessarily going to run fully physically defensive, and so Drain Punch is going to do quite a bit more, especially if you want to set up on it. But Registeel can be quite a problem with T-Wave and whatnot, just like crippling Mimikyu. Sorry, I'm just going to take a drink of water here. Excuse me. Sorry. I mentioned Celesteela and Skarmory a lot. They're kind of premier top tier defensive steals in Draft League in general. And so as a result, they're very good Mimikyu checks. Mega Steelix I put down there at the bottom. It's another really fat physically defensive steel type, as well as a physically defensive ground type. Basically anything that's really physically defensive that Mimikyu doesn't have a great way of breaking through is going to be able to beat you. There are a lot of exceptions to this. Very physically defensive mons that don't have the ability to beat, like, that are very weak to Ghost or Fairy spam. It's pretty easy to break through those kind of Pokemon. I'm trying to think of a good example off the top of my head, but something like Cofagrigus obviously is a very good physical wall, and it loses to Mimikyu in most cases. Despite giving up your disguise to Mummy, you might be able to get back in and get your disguise up later, sort of thing. And if your disguise is already broken, then it's really irrelevant what the Cofagrigus is going to do by taking away your disguise. Mega Scissor and Regular Scissor are kind of on their own, which is why I put them separately on here. The ability to revenge kill Mimikyu with Bullet Punch is really good. Mimikyu's lower physical defense leaves it sort of open to Mega Scissor and Regular Scissor just because of the natural physical defense that both of those Pokemon have, and the ability to revenge kill Mimikyu without feeling like they're pressured by Shadow Claw at all. It just means that they're quite big problems. And so all four of those Pokemon, or those variants of Pokemon, are really weak to fire. Some of them are weak to fighting, mons like the Steelix excuse me, in the Aggron, but they're really weak to fire. I wouldn't put Ferrothorn in this batch. I think Ferrothorn has a little bit harder of a time dealing with Mimikyu. You can Gyro Ball, but it's not going to one-shot the Mimikyu, so you generally want to rely on Thunder Wave, and then at the same time you need to be like Chople Berry to deal with the Drain Punch. So there's a lot of things that Ferrothorn has to do to check Mimikyu that the rest of your team can fairly easily beat, especially if it's Chople Berry and not Akka. That really leaves it open to the Fire type on your team, which is quite the weakness for Ferrothorn, and it's also putting it in a position where Ferrothorn might not be able to get up hazards if it's the dedicated Mimikyu check. So it definitely relieves a lot of pressure from what a Ferrothorn would normally do against a team. I put Gliscor on here just because Gliscor seemed to be quite the issue in WPL for me. I ran just a flat SD Ghostium set, and I had to crit the Gliscor to kill it. It was kind of just on a level of its own, and I wanted to give Mike a shout out for using that set in at the beginning of WPL week 1. Clefable's on here, and I guess in a sense you could put Quagsire or Pyukumuku on here, but Mimikyu has a much better way of dealing with unaware Pyukumuku and Quagsire in Woodhammer, and typically you would want to run Woodhammer against an unaware Water, or even something like a Melodic, something that's a little bit harder to break through with like the Marvel Scale Flame Orb set. You can just run SD Woodhammer, and it becomes a lot less of a problem. Something like a Politoad, which can be run physically defensive, you can just break through with SD Woodhammer. So I've run Grassium Z sets on Mimikyu in the past to break through Fat Waters, which is another sort of typing that would want to be able to deal with this stuff. Clefable, on the other hand, is quite the problem if it's unaware. It's really not going to die to many Shadow Claws, and you have to rely on Shadow Claw crits, which is unfortunately what you're not going to see all that often. Granted, Shadow Claw crits is more common than a regular crit, but the crit rate being, I think it's 1 in 24 in Gen 7, it's not good for Mimikyu to be able to break through an unaware Clefable. I put Kyurem Black and Excadrill on the side there just because they aren't defensive checks in Mimikyu by any means. Both of them kind of suck a lot against Mimikyu defensively, but they're both effective Mold Breaker and Terravolt users to be able to just get through Disguise. Necrozma is the other example of this. If Necrozma is really set up, then it can just break Mimikyu with Photon Geyser and not even worry about going through the Disguise at all. And so it's just a 1-turn kill instead of a 2-turn kill. Kyurem Black in particular has to be Scarfed for this to work. If you're a smart Mimikyu player, you're going to creep the Kyurem Black, and so it's definitely going to have to be Scarfed to break through this, but Kyurem Black does not appreciate player off by any means. If it's a Life Orb Ironhead set, it is just dying. It's dying to Mimikyu before it can get a hit off. Same with Excadrill. Both of them are naturally slower than Mimikyu, so they both need to be Choice Scarf to be able to deal with Mimikyu, because Excadrill can't really deal with too many Drain Punches. If it's going to switch into attacks, then that's definitely a problem, but if it's just revenge killing, then it might be fine. The last slide here that I have for you with real content on it is Mimikyu fodder. So these are a bunch of mons that in my experience I've found are complete and utter setup fodder for Mimikyu, as well as just not being able to deal with many of the common sets that I like to run, especially the Z-Splash set. All 6 of these are extremely weak to a Z-Splash set. Blissey in particular typically runs like Seismic Talk Rock's Double Recovery, has absolutely nothing to touch Mimikyu with. It is straight Sonic fodder. You can just Sword Dance in its face all day. Typically against Blissey, Cresselia, or Mew, you'd either want to Scout for Thunder Wave or Will-O-Wisp from the Mew in particular, or you'd want to run Lumberry against them. It's not all that necessary to run Lum if you have a Cleric in the back or you have Scouted previously for a Thunder Wave or Will-O-Wisp. Cresselia is another Mon. It just doesn't have the power to break through Mimikyu, and it's very physically defensive, but the fact that it's weak to Ghost really opens it up to that. It's the same sort of idea with Mew, but Mew has a little bit more wiggle room in the Mimikyu matchup because it can run status to cripple the Mimikyu, because it has better access to moves that'll be able to hit the Mimikyu, Steel-type moves and whatnot from the TM usage that it gets. Kinkeldr is sort of in a realm of its own, given that it's a nice physical threat against most teams, especially a team that's trying to support Mimikyu. It can definitely deal with mons like Crocodile that you might want to pair with the Mimikyu, and just be able to knock off items and be quite a nuisance. But Kinkeldr in general, Mimikyu is not weak to poison. I didn't talk about this, but Ghost covers the poison weakness of Mimikyu's Fairy, so it's only weak to other, and Fairy covers the Ghost's dark weakness, so it's only weak to Steel and Ghost, which doesn't open up a lot of room to be able to deal with Mimikyu offensively afterwards. Kinkeldr doesn't really get a way to hit Mimikyu based on that. It doesn't get Sorry, there we go. It doesn't get like good steel coverage to my knowledge. It definitely does not get good ghost coverage to my knowledge, and it really relies on its fighting stab, which Mimikyu can just switch into. So Kinkeldur's a Pokemon that I would typically switch Mimikyu into. If you're really scared about breaking your disguise, you probably shouldn't be against a Kinkeldur team. The disguise isn't going to help you out all that much. You don't really need it to set up on something like a Kinkeldur. Latios is another thing that really struggles against Mimikyu. It basically has to run Shadow Ball to even be able to hit you. You can definitely switch in on a -2 Latios if you wanted to just sack something to Draco. It's 100% setup fodder at that point. Psyshock's great and all, it's hitting you on the defensive side, but it really doesn't matter. It can't do anything to you, even if it's faster than you. You just click Shadow Sneak against it, and it's relatively frail on the physically defensive side to an extent. Snorlax is another example of a Pokemon that doesn't normally run coverage to hit Ghost types. Maybe against a Mimikyu team, it might run Shadow Claw against you, but even Curse variants of Snorlax typically would want to run Earthquake to hit your Steel type rather than running a Ghost coverage move, and so Snorlax is another example of Mimikyu fodder. Kinkeldurr is probably one of the easier examples of this, but other pure fighting types like that can't touch Mimikyu are good examples of that. Fighting types that could hit Mimikyu back and be threatening, things like Infernape, things like Terrakion, things like Cobalion as well. Cobalion's a little bit of a harder mon to deal with just because your play rough isn't super effective against them, but in general, fighting types are just complete fodder for Mimikyu. Snorlax is maybe on the end of harder to deal with fodder, but that's just sort of an example is physically offensive normals, even specially offensive normals, but most specially offensive normals will run Shadow Ball against just to get ghost coverage to be able to hit ghost types. So that's sort of what I had anticipated in terms of fodder for the Mimikyu. If you have any other examples, please feel free to put them in the comments below. I've obviously missed stuff. I didn't really have room for a ton of stuff, so I sort of went by alphabetically, and then I just sort of started scrolling once I saw some stuff that caught my eye. Last but not least, sort of dealing with the lag here a little bit here, but big thing, big notes that I want to summarize with this video. You really want to pair Mimikyu with an offensive fire ground. I forgot to write fighting on here, but fighting as well. Those three types really help out Mimikyu. Just being able to break through steel types, it's super important. And having any one of those, a fire ground or a fighting, takes a lot of pressure off of Mimikyu as well. If they have like a fat water to deal with any of those, then you can just draft an electric type around that as well. So there's a lot of team synergy options that you can do to sort of back up Mimikyu. Again, my best play with Mimikyu normally is keeping it in the back and making a plan to get the necessary chip damage that I need. Good examples of this are my UPBA Season 2 Week 1 match would be a great example of this. My WPL Season 8 Week 1 match is probably a bad example of this, but it might also be a good example of this, just sort of Mimikyu staying in the back until it can clean. I'm sure there are other examples. Oh, my LET Season 1 match against CM. I can't remember what week that was. Maybe week 10 is what I would say off the top of my head. That was a good example of this. Hazard support isn't all that necessary, but it's sort of part of make a plan to get the necessary chip. You don't necessarily need hazard support for the Pokemon to do well, but the necessary hazard support there is a way to get the chip that you need. Good scouting. This is another thing that I sort of harped on a little bit in terms of the checks there. You definitely want to be able to scout the status that they're going to want to throw at your Mimikyu. That's the biggest problem that Mimikyu is going to run into is being paralyzed or burnt, especially if you don't have a cleric or you're not in a position in the game where you can get a cleric in to heal you, or your cleric's just dead at that point in the game. That's another thing. Good scouting for random coverage moves that might want to come off and hit your Mimikyu for sure as well. And being able to tell what you can set up on is another part of good scouting. Keeping in the back I mentioned a little bit earlier, as well as proper planning equals more setup fodder. So that point, I sort of wanted to harp on the good scouting a little bit more, but if you can scout and you've done your calcs early on in the game, then you know exactly what you can set up on, you know exactly how much chip you need, and that is just where it is the most satisfying thing in the world to see Mimikyu clean up an entire team. If you guys want any more sort of examples of my Mimikyu play, please feel free to go through the channel. I don't have a ton of specific games that I can harp on, but I do have 52 games of experience. Feel free to check me out on Pokemon Showdown replays, and you might be able to find some Mimikyu games from me as well. My Showdown name is Ladner Lantern, if you did not know, and that is going to be for me. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll catch you guys next time.